TributePod production.
Feeling good? Here we go. Hello and welcome to Open Secret, the power of open source intelligence. I'm Kylie Pert.
And I'm Jane Van Teenham. Thanks for joining us.
In today's episode, we'll be talking with Cameron Mitchell, the Head of Geopolitical Risk at ANZ Bank, and discussing the importance of open source intelligence in the financial sector. We asked Cameron to share a bit about his experience in all source intelligence, his unique insights into open source intelligence analytical tradecraft and techniques, and his passion for realpolitik. Be sure to listen all the way through as Jane and I uncover the value of strategic open source intelligence advice in helping multinational companies better navigate geopolitical and organisational risk. Joining us on the pod today is my old friend and colleague Cameron Mitchell. Cam is the Head of Geopolitical Risk at ANZ Bank and has spent over 20 years working in strategic intelligence roles, both with government and in the private sector. In the early part of his career, Cameron worked in the Australian intelligence community, looking at Russia, China, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. His sense of adventure then saw him deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan in operational intelligence roles. And since leaving government, Cameron has put his unique intelligence experience to good use, working for a number of multinational financial institutions, including HSBC and now at ANZ. In his current role, Cameron developed and manages the bank's geopolitical risk function. Cam has a Master of Studies in International Relations from Cambridge, a Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of New South Wales, and a Bachelor of Arts majoring in Political Science and History from the University of Sydney. He's also an author of articles and a book about the Russian defence industry. Welcome, Cam. Thanks for joining us on the pod today.
Pleasure, Kylie. Yeah, nice to be with you. Looking forward to the session.
Cam, what does the Head of Geopolitical Risk do? And why is this role important for a big bank like ANZ?
Financial institutions are one of a group of private sector companies that do look a lot more closely at geopolitical risk than they used to. I think traditionally it would have been the extractives industry, oil and gas, mining firms, companies that were operating in frontier markets in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, all through to today. They've always been looking at political risk quite closely. I think the financial services sector started to look at it more closely in the last 5 to 10 years because there's been this convergence of geopolitics and business in the world, particularly with governments that are increasingly looking to execute foreign policy through businesses. You know, this is the idea of the gradual weaponization of the US dollar, the rise of sanctions policies around the world, and then more recently, export controls, potential outbound and inbound investment screening. These are the sorts of things that the governments around the world are looking to prosecute as part of a bigger focus on economic security. And when they're doing things like that, of course, businesses get more and more involved. So that they need to be compliant with regulations and make sure they stay one step ahead of the environment. So in terms of what I do in the bank, it's more about proactively ensuring that the senior management is well armed to deal with geopolitical risks before they happen. We're not really in the predicting the future business. It's more around developing some sort of robust understanding and robust measures to address or deal with geopolitical risks before they happen. So as I said, it's not about predicting the future. A lot of these geopolitical risks you can kind of see coming or potentially coming. The challenge is working out which one comes when. And that's really my role in the bank.
And so, Cam, when you talk about geopolitical risk, how would someone on the street understand it? And how is it relevant to them?
Great question. So I would explain geopolitical risk to someone on the street as the relationships between countries and how they engage each other in full spectrum engagement. That would be either through diplomatic engagement, obviously, at worst, military engagement, and now indeed through economic engagement. And that's particularly relevant, as I said, in the last 5 to 10 years. Now that there's been a sort of a return of great power competition, there's millions of books. It's a cottage industry now in terms of writing a book on geopolitical risk and great power competition being bad.
Right up your alley, Kim.
Yeah, so I guess the person on the street will see a lot more books on the subject. How is it relevant to them? With the world being, very interconnected, we've come off this sort of period of peak globalization. in terms of supply chains, interconnectivity between people and businesses, that hasn't gone away. I mean, globalization is very sticky, but it is being reconsidered or rethought by some governments as they do spend more time focusing on this concept of economic security. So this is the idea of what supply lines or what supply chains can be trusted, which ones are more susceptible to shock, and therefore which of those supply chains need to be restructured towards more friendly countries or countries that you can trust. And I think that's happening across the board. You know, I mean, China and the United States are the biggest examples, but we're seeing that across a number of other countries as well, most notably since the COVID outbreak in 2020 and then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that was supply chains around health, PPE, vaccines. Where are you getting these from? Are they trusted and stable supply chains? And then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, people started thinking a lot more about energy security and food security. And I think that's where it all does come back to the person on the street. Being ahead of these geopolitical trends as a government or as an institution or a corporate means that your clients or your populations are better insulated from the risks before they arise. And hopefully you avoid some of the nastiest supply chain shocks. And then in extremis, of course, we're talking conflict between states, and that creates all sorts of implications for the person on the street.
Yeah, some very complex issues in there, Cam. What kinds of advice are you providing to the decision makers at ANZ in helping them navigate these complex geopolitical issues and instability across the globe?
I guess the first way I'd answer that would be to provide some context.
Great.
There is a lot of anxiety these days. There are two conflicts bubbling away in Europe and the Middle East, respectively. There are fears of potential conflicts in Asia and so on. And that's, I think, an environment that people that perhaps haven't got a background in international relations or that are primarily focused on business, certainly for the last 20 to 30 years, they're not familiar with that. I'm not suggesting there haven't been conflicts since 1991. Of course there have, but the conflicts that are bubbling away now or that are being created now are being driven from actors that people are less familiar with.
Yes.
You know, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, I think, is a really good example. Israel, Hamas. So I think the first thing I try and do when I'm providing updates on these issues is to provide some context. Perspective is key. So people are concerned that it does look like a far more volatile world at the moment. And this is where a little bit of history is helpful. I often counter when people talk about 2023 being a really unpredictable and quite concerning year. Geopolitically, I'll try and compare that and sort of remind people that, 1968 was a pretty nasty year in global history as well. You had massive protests in Washington over the Vietnam War. You had the Tet Offensive bubbling away in Vietnam. In Europe, you had the toppling of the de Gaulle government with massive student protests in Paris. Student protests across Europe, in fact, and other Western markets. You had Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in the same year, and it was 1 year after the 1967 Six-Day War in the Middle East. So that was a pretty nasty year as well. So I think some context is very helpful. It helps people try and park what they're dealing with today into a historical framework, and I think that's really important. A more tactical or specific example that I experienced in Hong Kong was when I started my role at HSBC in 2014. We had the Occupy Central protests and the umbrella protests and subsequent protests later in that city. But there were some real concerns around Occupy Central. Protesters had taken up large tracts of what isn't very available land in Hong Kong, in the Central District and in the Mong Kok District. And there were some big concerns among the business community in Hong Kong. And again, the context, I tried to remind them that compared to Occupy Wall Street, which was another issue that had happened about a year before, the levels of violence were actually far lower. The police response was quite measured. Protesters were often, picking up their rubbish after the protests. So it's a good sort of contextual framework for people to then understand the situation in which they're dealing with at the given time.
How then is this, if at all, different to the intelligence work that we did in government?
Yeah, so in terms of the work that's done, it's remarkably similar. You don't have an organisation behind you providing you with all sorts of classified information sources and so on. But the outputs are very similar. And in fact, I'm really thankful that you and I and a number of our colleagues cut our teeth in an all-source intelligence agency. We had a lot of good background and good tradecraft drilled into us. And I think that's put me in good stead in the roles that I've had in the private sector since. The idea of being dispassionate in your analysis, avoiding values judgments, putting the bottom line assessment up front and the supporting evidence underneath. They're the sorts of things I'll do as just part of my day job at ANZ from a geopolitical risk perspective. So I think that's where it's very similar. Where it's different is we don't have a rigorous editing process. We don't have 10 or 12 analysts we can rely on to sort of make sure our drafts are squeaky clean before they are released. I think that's actually a strength and a weakness. It means that you can publish in a very timely fashion. It means that you can make sure you're getting to the right customers or clients within the institution and more broadly, quite quickly. The challenge, of course, is you need to be really sure that what you've done in terms of the assessments and what you've crafted is fit for purpose. And often that requires leveraging your network that you've built up, talking to experts who may know the issue far better than you. And then, of course, leveraging a good network of political risk consultancies, basically road testing some of your assessments prior to publication.
Cam, there are a couple of things coming up that I think we'd like to develop with you. Listening about Israel and Hamas and some of the challenges that you're confronted with and needing to offer historical context, give a sense of what's occurring on the ground, an understanding of statecraft as well as perhaps influences and crowdsourcing. How does open source intelligence play out in your role and how do you engage with it as a part of affording ANZ with geopolitical risk analysis?
Look, it's all about open source, to be honest. I mean, I'm not in government anymore, so your sources are very much going to be open source. And of course, it's a really deep pool of content and information. The key is trying to sort of cut through the noise and then isolate those particular information flows that are worth your time. Explaining how you do that is a pretty difficult task. I think a lot of it does come down to trial and error. A lot of it comes down to time in the seat and working out which sources are not that helpful. The other thing, of course, is with open source, particularly on the social media platforms like X and so on, there's a lot of what appear to be really juicy scoops, lots of tactical updates and things that look really interesting. In my role, I have the luxury of being able to, look at those on occasion, potentially roll them in to my assessments if I can find corroborating information and so on. But most of the time, I can avoid those things because my role is inherently strategic rather than tactical. And in terms of the products that we produce at ANZ, we have two. We have sort of longer form assessments, which are sort of over the next 1 to 2 years. And then we have flash reports, which are more immediate developments that stakeholders in the bank need information about. And also having mile wide and hopefully in some instances several inches deep knowledge of some of the issues that we're dealing with. It means that you end up knowing who's worth following and who is not. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
So I've got a good little stable of people that I rely upon in terms of their output. And I just tend to hone in on their data and their updates. And then obviously we'll cross-reference that with some other sources. So hopefully that sort of goes a little bit of a way to answering the question.
Yeah, thank you. I think in the world of open source intelligence, credibility and reliability of sources is just as important as it is in the world of intelligence. It's a very similar methodology.
Absolutely.
You did mention there earlier when you were talking about your role is not just regurgitating newspaper clippings. And I think when we all started, at least in the confines of the government in the intelligence community, really open source intelligence was synonymous with newspaper clippings. What about foreign language sources? How do you engage with that? Because that would be a challenge, I expect, in your role where you're needing to engage and understand different countries around the world. They're not likely to be posting anything online in English. And so how do you interact with different languages and environments?
Yeah, super question. Where it's very helpful is finding those trusted information providers that I referenced before. So there's a particular individual based in the US, for example, that translates the front page of the People's Daily in China every day and puts that out in a Substack. There are a couple of other experts who are fluent Arabic speakers or fluent Mandarin speakers or whatever it may be that will often translate key insights from journals or from government-released information pieces and so on that end up getting onto the internet quite quickly. And that, to be honest, is my first port of call or reference point. So I don't ignore the foreign language sources. I think it's incredibly important if you're about to put an assessment out on a particular country or that relates to a particular country, you've at least have the capacity to look at some of those local sources. So that would be where I'd focus my attention.
Cam, I was wondering, just with social media being as prolific as what it is, I'm sure that some of your executives and board members are on X and on all sorts of different platforms, hearing all sorts of different news and coming to you about judgments that they might have formed on the basis of that information. How do you counter some of the misinformation potentially that they're exposed to and set some ground truths around what is happening, from a geopolitical risk perspective?
Yeah, that is actually that's an ongoing challenge. It's just an ongoing part of the role of a geopolitical risk manager, an intelligence analyst, or whoever it may be. And it's a really good question, because if there's a degree of art to producing an assessment, you need to get an understanding of what's the zeitgeist right now, how are people perceiving a particular issue, and then how am I going to frame or create my assessment to counter some of those prevailing views if you think they're incorrect, but without pushing your assessment into the bounds of being an op-ed or a counter piece. And the other thing is, look, the longer you're in the seat, the more you understand your stakeholders. I know that there's a couple of our seniors that are very engaged on the geopolitical side of things, and I'm able to speak with them independently and provide some context and talk through. No one has a mortgage on the truth here. It's more about being able to have an open conversation and maybe push back gently against some of those opinions or views that have been formed through social media. And the language we use is pretty carefully selected to ensure that the reader is left without a sense of uncertainty as to what the message is.
Excellent.
So hopefully that provides a natural foil or a natural counter to the more emotive or opinion-focused views that obviously proliferate on social media.
So critical and at the heart of all good analytical tradecraft, wouldn't you say, Cam?
I couldn't agree with you more, Carly.
Providing impactful advice to decision makers.
That's right.
Cam, you mentioned stakeholders quite a few times. I know you're a one-man band, but you can't do the job by yourself. It sounds like collaboration and partnerships are critical to your success. Can you tell us a little bit more about your engagement with stakeholders?
Talking about stakeholders, I guess there's two buckets. There's the sort of stakeholders that I rely upon to help craft my assessments and make sure they're fit for purpose. They're not always external. There is an incredibly good knowledge base inside financial institutions. You can imagine the sorts of people that work project finance deals or that are involved in really big projects overseas. Some of the insights they have and their knowledge is incredible. So it's really important to be able to engage those people where possible. Outside, of course, it's the think tankers. Obviously some think tanks are very impartial. Other think tanks are a little bit more partisan. That's important, particularly when it comes to US politics, getting a good sort of insight in terms of the way the Democrats are thinking about particular issues or the Republicans. That's important. But then of course, if you're looking for the impartial sort of assessment, once you've got all of the information on that partisan perspective, then you would talk to a different stakeholder. So I think all of those things are important. We're also really well served by political risk consultancies, many of which are really well placed in the countries in which they operate. They're a really important resource. And they're the external stakeholders and the internal stakeholders that shape the assessments, if you like. And then the stakeholders internally are very much senior management, our risk and strategy professionals, those that are trying to work out where the bank wants to be positioned over the next 5 years or so, or the more traditional risk functions in a financial institution, those credit officers, the market risk and country risk teams. In fact, we've started to do more fused analysis where we've ended up picking out people from the country risk team. That's essentially an in-house ratings agency for a bank. The geopolitical risk team, the cyber threat team, and some of our corporate or sort of group security staff, and some of our financial crime professionals. So the idea being that when there's a crisis that emerges that touches on all of those aspects, it's far better for a busy executive to get a fused briefing.
Absolutely.
Summarizing all of those aspects of the crisis rather than 7 separate reports. So that happens quite a lot. And then finally, potentially our most important stakeholder for a financial institution is our client base. So the written assessments will go to our staff in-house, and then we can do some oral briefings to clients if and when required.
For your clients and leadership who don't always have a background in intelligence, how do you help them understand the value of intelligence advice in their decision-making?
Kylie, I think that was a harder argument to present 10 years ago. So when I started in the banking sector, I'd argue for every person that thought it was a great idea that geopolitical risk was now done in-house, there was probably another person that thought, we've been banking for 100 and something years already and we've never really needed this function before. We've gone through 2 world wars and survived and so on. So why do we need this in-house? My first point would be, a complacent approach to geopolitics probably wouldn't have got a financial institution through 2 world wars, even if they didn't have a person with the title geopolitical risk sort of lead, on their business card. I think more recently, it's not as much of an effort to justify why geopolitical risk assessments are an important component of a financial institution or indeed, another corporate. I think we've seen this bigger focus across many markets on economic security, the expectation that businesses play some kind of role in foreign policy now, be it in complying with sanctions. There's now a values-driven supply chain in many parts of the world where governments will expect companies to have supply chains that are free of slave labor. These are the sorts of things that all carry some kind of geopolitical connection. And indeed, a lot of the policies rub against each other. If you're complying with regulations in the United States, you're potentially non-compliant with similar regulations in China. So I think being able to understand those things is really important.
Critical.
So I think that's where it's an easier lift now to sort of explain why the function needs to be around. In terms of where the rubber hits the road, the function serves 2 purposes. One of it is advisory. So it's definitely keeping busy executives and clients abreast of going geopolitical developments, explaining the background or at least what the implications are of latest news headlines. So that is important. And then the other aspect, I suppose, is the operationalizing of that geopolitical insight and intelligence. And that's very much something that we do. That is the idea of developing indicators and warnings. Again, Kylie, someone who's worked in the Defence Department, some of these terms are going to be quite familiar to you.
That's right.
But the idea of indicators and warnings for conflict scenarios or indicators and warnings for a deterioration in relations between 2 countries, which are markets for one particular organisation. Those things are really important because it means that you can position yourself in a proactive way to oncoming challenges rather than in a reactive way. And we also spend a lot more time doing stress tests. So stress tests in a financial institution, there's obviously a scenario component and then some very impressive individuals in the financial institution, actuarials and others who have got a deep understanding of mathematics and data are able to then crunch through the scenario and try and work out how that stresses the financial health of that institution. Those stress tests these days, you'd be unsurprised to hear there are more scenarios of a geopolitical nature than there were in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Cam, what are your hot tips for producing quality open source intelligence products for the financial sector?
I'm delighted to have that question asked to me because I was hoping I could squeeze in a Mark Twain quote at some point today.
Ah, nice.
And my favourite one is, if I'd had more time, I'd have written a shorter letter. It's very easy to write a long-winded assessment on a particular issue. It's very difficult to cut that down to really important takeaway assessments that are actionable for a very busy customer set that do not spend all of their time thinking about geopolitics. It means you've really got your work cut out for you. So first up, it's really important that you write succinctly. And I think it's important that you write persuasively, but not passionately. You should still be able to keep the reader's attention with persuasive language and avoiding all of those emotive terms that will ultimately end up having your assessments misconstrued, or at worst, having people get quite upset about what you've written and then pushing back. That's not the purpose of the intelligence assessment or the strategic assessment. It's about finding actionable items that busy executives and others can use. The other thing I think that's really important is we tailor the reporting where possible. You need to adjust your approach depending on the customer set. Now, that's often a luxury. My writing goes to a pretty big group of people within the bank. So I think there's a real knack to try to create an assessment that appeals or is relevant to stakeholders of a pretty broad nature. The other knack, I think, that's often difficult to get right is boiling down some pretty complex geopolitical trends and developments for a customer set, as I said, that often isn't deeply in the weeds on these issues. And there's a risk of oversimplification. And of course, that's something you need to avoid. But I do think it helps to come up with sort of sound bites, things that will stick in people's minds. So I often use acronyms to try and sort of summarize or boil down complex issues.
Me too, Cam.
Yeah, there you go, Kylie. I mean, it is a useful tool.
Yeah.
The big acronym that I use a lot is UNTIDI. The U is for the uneven energy transition. The N is for new trading patterns. The T is for trusted technologies. The first of the two I's is industrial policy. The D is defense. And then the final I is ideology.
Yeah, I love that.
And I think as a rule of thumb, if you're thinking, so how is geopolitics going to impact business over the next 10 years or so, I think that 6-letter acronym is a pretty useful guide.
Strikes me, Cam, that you'd be very good at Wordle. Yeah.
Well, not as good as I'd like to be, Jane, but yeah, it's something I do get into.
That's okay. I do my Wordle every day. Unsurprising to all of you. It had dawned on me thinking about your UNTIDI acronym, Cam, that it's a beautiful example of a structured analytical technique. I'll just be using in my next course, if you don't mind. I might just quote you and borrow UNTIDI.
Yeah, nice to talk about something other than the analysis of competing hypotheses, Kylie.
Yes, thank you, Cam. UNTIDI will be my new lesson.
Yeah.
Cam, what are the 3 key geopolitical and or economic issues that keep you up at night?
I can't tell, Kylie, whether this is a joke question or not, because I remember when we were working together in defence many years ago, we used to say the most annoying question an analyst can ever be given is, so what keeps you up at night?
Total plant.
So telling. It's so telling, though.
I will now endeavour to answer that question. Look, it's the longer term risks that governments will find it very hard to address. Let's be honest, the governments around the world are dealing with disparate geopolitical risks, social risks. There's a fiscal element here with higher inflation, questions over a budget capacity. And when you're working in government, you have a tendency to try and address the short term risks, rightly so. And the problem is those longer term risks don't get addressed as readily as they might be. And for me, the one that jumps out, to be honest, is the energy transition, where we're beginning to see a reckoning now where you're hearing government officials from different countries beginning to say, goodness, we are really not funding this transition in the way that we need to be funding it in order to get the outcomes we're looking for. So I'd say the thing that keeps me up at night is probably how countries deal with that energy transition and commitments to their carbon reduction targets. And that is flagged, to be honest, in the uneven energy transition element of my UNTIDI acronym, because geopolitics is going to play a big role here. You're going to have countries that wield significant heft in the hydrocarbon space using that to suit their own interests. Likewise, you're going to have countries that are dominating the renewable energy space, and those elements that you need to get to the climate transition securely and safely, potentially using that heft to suit their own interests as well. So I think that's something that's perhaps under-analysed at this point and something we need to give more time to.
Sounds like the challenge energises you, Cam, which I love.
Absolutely, Jane. I have a very short attention span. It's a perfect role in that there are just so many different things to cover in any given day. I really enjoy that. And it's good for my own personal discipline to try and knuckle down and really do some deep analysis on the issues that matter as well. So, yeah, there's plenty to keep me up at night, as you would say.
Cam, you mentioned that you've been in your role now for nearly 3 years. You came in at a time when you needed to set up this capability. I'm wondering if you would have done anything differently, and if so, what that was?
Jane, I'm going to fairly flippantly say I wouldn't do too much differently, but I'm also going to caveat that by saying I was really blessed when I joined the bank that I had a leadership cohort that was really supportive of the function. I mean, they set it up from nothing. And half the battle in these roles is building up your agency with senior management. It's really important to work out where you're going to place a geopolitical risk function. It needs to be high enough up the chain that it's got the agency that it needs, but also in the sort of org structure deeply enough that you're actually doing things that have a material impact. You're operationalizing that geopolitical risk. ANZ has the biggest international exposure out of the big 4 banks. We're a big trade bank, so it was very much an easier sell. I think the senior management could see why having an in-house function would be useful. And again, I've been really empowered by that leadership group. That's why perhaps I wouldn't have done too much differently. Maybe on a personal note, I love briefing clients, and that's a big part of my role.
Do you love chatting, Cam?
Funnily enough, Kylie, I do really enjoy talking to people.
About geopolitics?
Yeah. And I think not necessarily I would have done it differently, but if I'd had more capacity to balance out the competing demands of the role, where I was able to spend more time researching issues. But, look, there are solutions to that as well in terms of building out team structures and so on. So all in all, I'm pretty comfortable with where things are at.
Cam, you're also involved in the ANU Futures Hub. Can you tell us a little bit about how that relates to the work that you're doing at ANZ?
I've only been at the Futures Hub for a few months now, but I can sing at the ANU and the National Security College's praises. They're really walking the walk on taking this whole of nation approach to strategic issues.
Great.
And, ANZ likewise was, good enough to say, yeah, of course, we should be involved in this in some way. So I do think that the NSC's done a really good job in trying to connect the right groups of people from different parts of working Australia to try and address some of these issues. Because when we're looking at the UNTIDI acronym, this isn't something that a bank should just be looking at, or a government should just be looking at, or an academic institution.
Oh, that's right.
So the more cross-engagement you have on those issues, I think the better the outcomes. And to be honest, that's what I've noticed since coming back to Australia. There is definitely a willingness in several quarters to try and engage stakeholders that you may not have engaged 7 or 8 years ago on these kinds of major issues. And that's a really positive step.
That is good to hear. And it's good to have you back in the country.
Nice to be back, Carlos.
It's been a real pleasure speaking with you and gaining valuable insight into how OSINT supports decision-making in private industry, in this case, the financial sector, and also how this discussion has highlighted the importance of public-private partnerships in tackling big national security issues. Thanks again for joining us, Cam.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
You've been listening to Open Secret, the power of open source intelligence. Open Secret was created by Kylie Pert, Amanda Shane, and Jane Van Tienen. A podcast by OSINT Combine. Make sure to visit our website, osintcombine.com, for information on how OSINT Combine can help you find, analyse, and act using open source information. Open Secret is recorded on the lands of the Kabi Kabi people. OSINT Combine acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the land where we work, live, and learn.
A TributePod production.